Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next edition of our Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday lecture series. Tonight, I would like to remind everybody to mute yourselves during our lecture. And if you have questions during the talk, feel free to add those questions into the chat box, or you can save them to the end. We have a small group and we can probably have kind of more of a discussion tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Gottlieb. I'm the Education Director with the Western Flyer Foundation. I would like to thank our sponsors for this talk tonight, the Monterey Public Library, the Cannery Row Foundation, and the Cannery Row Company, and of course the Western Flyer Foundation. This afternoon, we are really lucky to be joined by Pete Barraza. Pete is an English teacher at Santa Monica High School. He's also the founder of the Steinbeck Youth Institute, which brings students up into Steinbeck country, and they put out a literary journal called the Hour of the Pearl. Is that right, Pete? Is that the title?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So it's a really neat program. Pete's going to be talking to us tonight about jazz, urban fire, and the blues. So I'm going to pass it over to Pete, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Emily. It's so nice to be here, to be there, to be somewhere, to be involved with this. I have been teaching for 6 years, and I think one of the core authors has always been Steinbeck in almost all of my classes. Currently, I teach a 12th grade advanced placement literature course. I teach a California literature course, and those courses have a good chunk of Steinbeck as part of the curriculum. Like you said, Emily, I also run the Steinbeck Youth Institute, which is somewhat of a high school version of the NEH Steinbeck Institute for Professionals, which I have the fortune of being involved with every other summer in Pacific Grove. So I'm going to begin really quickly by asking if anyone has any immediate questions that we can maybe get them out of the way now. Just if you have any questions about Sweet Thursday, about jazz or Pachuco jazz, just any immediate questions that you've been thinking about in the last day or so. Anyone? Can you all see me and hear me fine enough? Okay.
I have a question, might be kind of naive, but having read Cannery Row, and my name is Robert, and I know that Ed Ricketts was very much into music, and including Bach and classical music. And his son, Ed Ricketts Jr., had a trumpet and liked jazz. And is what you're going to be talking about going to include a little bit of that part of it? And when you read Cannery Row, they talk about the parties and music that's probably playing at the parties, and he had a phonograph and had records and stuff. Is that
I'm gonna play a little music for you all along the way. But
okay. And one other thing real quick, I've seen in current times where some of Mozart's music, for example, has been put into jazz, like a jazz format. So sure. That's all. It's my curiosities. That's all.
Well, really quickly, I won't be talking about classical music today, except for American classical music a bit, which is considered jazz. And that trumpet might have been a gift from Steinbeck to Ricketts' son, if I remember correctly, his first instrument, but I could be wrong. But let's get going, because I'm going to break this talk up in 3 parts. And I'm doing this from home today because I stayed home because I was a little under the weather this morning. I had hoped to be in my classroom doing this. Then I thought about, when I play a song for you that deals with marijuana a little later, I'm sure my school district would have filtered that. So I'm actually kind of happy I'm home. Yeah. So let me begin with this first part. As a teacher, you can see that I teach Cannery Row, and I teach a little bit about Ed Ricketts, and I'm involved in the NEH program, concerning Steinbeck as an ecologist and a social critic. But my love has been to connect Steinbeck's works, primarily Cannery Row, to my love of jazz. And prior to teaching at Santa Monica High School, I taught at the Punahou Academy in Honolulu, where I taught jazz literature. And I'm not a musician, but I do ask students to look at the intersections between literature, music, and visual arts. So you can see these photos here. That's a poster of the Jazz Festival, where you can see Armstrong, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, and others, John Handy. So, you know, I put a picture of the lab there because I will eventually get to Sweet Thursday, but I'm going to go through Cannery Row first. You see a picture of Ricketts's lab there, and most of you know that the Monterey Jazz Festival kind of started there after Ed Ricketts's passing, and it's been going for quite some time. Yeah, and you probably recognize some of these artists. Yeah, and you can you recognize Ricketts on the bottom, and Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Steinbeck, I believe, in his cottage, and Louis Armstrong. Yeah. So as I mentioned already, the lab is probably the birthplace of the Monterey Jazz Festival. And, you know, I'm going to get to the Pachuco jazz stuff, but I think we need to go through this first because, you know, the Pachuco jazz scene is something that really kind of flourished here in Los Angeles and influenced by a lot of these musicians and a lot of things that were happening on the East Coast as well. So these are a few other artists at the Monterey Jazz Festival along the way. You'll see that the gentleman up on the right-hand corner is Charles Lloyd. He's still playing. He's in his 80s. You'll see that Sonny Rollins on the bottom. Okay. Let's see. So, you know, for years, I taught Cannery Row through the basic metaphor of looking at communities through tide pools. You know, it's something that students can gravitate towards, they understand. And, but more recently, I've been teaching Cannery Row through a metaphor of jazz and through musical composition. Now, I can't see any names on my screen, but I can see a few, and I can only see a few of you, but I see a couple of you. If maybe you can give me a thumbs up if I ask a question. Yeah, you see this, thank you. You see this simple dichotomy of the book, you know, where there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of pain. For those of you, most people know Cannery Row versus Sweet Thursday. And so, you know, looking at these dichotomies, these dualities, such as humor and pain, there's so much that you know we can relate to this with music and visual arts, including jazz. Yeah. You might recognize the Picasso piece. Yeah, and that's a Omari Bearden piece in the bottom. And this is a quote. I'm not going to read all of it. Maybe you can read it as I'm talking about it. But this is by Robert O'Mealy, who teaches at Columbia and runs a major jazz program there. And, you know, so much of what is being asked, I think, of educators and of students is to be able to make these kind of what we call interdisciplinary connections between literature and visual arts and jazz in this case. Okay. So I have a really good time teaching California literature. And you can see that this is a copy, just a book cover of The Grapes of Wrath. And I use these, for example, these kind of mediums to discuss The Grapes of Wrath, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, you know, political cartoons, classic photography, and other forms of art as well. in reading, Cannery Row and of course Sweet Thursday, we read a character who is oftentimes set apart, lonely, where everybody wants to do something nice for him. Yeah. And but he seems to be suffering from some emptiness or void. And what I often do is not only ask students to explicate the language in both novels, but to kind of make comparisons with the emotional stuff that is experiencing through the music. And that includes the music that the gentleman mentioned earlier, some of the Gregorian music, some of the classical music, and even some of the jazz that's played, such as the Benny Goodman pieces mentioned. Yeah. If you think about the way the book is put together, you're paying attention to an individual at one point. And we get the luxury to get to know Mac, for example, at one point in the book, but we also see them as a group. And this is a clear relationship to any kind of ecological kind of metaphors we're looking at the book, but also with a quartet or a band, right? Or somebody performing a solo and having to rely on each other. Yeah. And to kind of understand the dissonance and the harmonies that are happening in the book, because as Mac points out, especially, well, in both books, when Doc is sad, everybody's sad, right? And so there's this interconnectedness that's really beautiful that can be seen through different lenses, such as music. This is a really beautiful piece of art that one of my former students did through marbling, it's called. And this is one of my favorite quotes about the blues. And this is from Ralph Ellison. And he writes that the blues is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and not to transcend it. Not by the consolation of philosophy, but by squeezing from it a near tragic, near comic lyricism. As a form, the blues is an autobiographical chronicle of personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. And what I tell students is that when you read characters like Mac, for example, who is always joking around to kind of cover his pain, or Henri, who keeps repeating the same mistakes, who's never wanting to finish his boat, or Doc, who seems to be stuck until he meets Susie, for example. There's some pain that's being repeated, almost like through a cycle of trauma, where they need to feel that emotion, even though they might not know it. They can't articulate it. So the music allows us to understand that could be another form of articulation with the kind of emotions, the sadness that some of the characters are experiencing. And there's Mac. Yeah. And if you remember from the book, that's his story about at one point having a wife. He can never get things right. And so he just got to clowning all the time. But that's a really sad story, right? And a lot of you know, if not all of you know, that I think in 1960, Duke Ellington produced some music as an homage to Sweet Thursday. And there's a song called The Misfit Blues, which I'll play for you in a little while, which for me is a direct link to Mac in both books. Yeah. So it's really clear from the beginning of the book that Steinbeck is setting up these kind of lenses, these dualities, these this deconstruction of looking at something through a nearsightedness. And in many ways, when you listen to some of the music that's associated with the time, the call and a response, the different movements of music, it's a nice pairing with some of these things that are happening in the book. I know I'm moving a little quickly, but does anyone have a question before I continue? Okay.
It's excellent so far, and everything I hope for and beyond. I can't wait to hear the blues piece that you're going to play, because I didn't know that, for example.
Okay. So oops, sorry. I'm not sure if when we're reading this, we're talking about ecology, community, or a band playing on stage. And I love that, this, I think this is from Susan's introduction to Cannery Row, Susan Schillinglaw. And this is about interconnectedness. And one way to teach that theme in literature is by having students really listen carefully to music. And even if students don't have the kind of toolbox or the language of a musician, by just listening, it prepares them to read more closely, to be able to kind of deconstruct those things that are playing off of each other. In Cannery Row, the majority of music that's mentioned is the Gregorian music, the classical pieces, right? The piece called Amor, which I love playing for my students. But one of the great scenes is when the parties kind of get out of hand. Yeah. And you can imagine Mac and the boys kind of breaking up the place, Doc's place, but also just the kind of fun they're having with this kind of music, right? And when we think about jazz, there are lots of lenses of thinking about jazz. Jazz is a safe kind of music. You go and you dance, and it's big band music. But there's also jazz that's played, on the margins of society, or that after midnight, which becomes, a little more dangerous. And even Benny Goodman, when playing swing music in certain parts of Los Angeles, for example, in the 40s, that was considered a little bit of a risk, a little undergroundish. So here's one of the songs by Benny Goodman's trio. Not any particular song mentioned in the book, but here's something you can hear that might give you a sense of the kind of activity Mac and the boys are having at the parties. I'm assuming you all could hear that. Mm-hmm. When I play this music for my students, they think, oh, that's just old-fashioned music. Little do they know how, risque it could have been at the time. Oops, sorry. Once again, that's if you don't recognize it, this is a Google Doodle that Google made for Cannery Row several years ago. It's really cool. That Doc is a fine fellow. We ought to do something for him. And music is often at the center of what Doc is doing. When they want Doc to kind of heal, they want him to go to his place and play that churchy music and Sweet Thursday, right? It's just a powerful place that really is the place of the phonograph, as one of you mentioned earlier, the place that is communal through the music, the place that allows them to kind of have that space for each other. So this is more for educators, yeah. And what I ask students to do is I give them Susan Schillinglaw's quote, after reading the book, and I have them sometimes produce art based on the book. And a lot of my students who are musicians will produce songs, and not necessarily jazz, and paintings, or they'll do little musical performances, or they'll do an annotated playlist, which is pretty cool. Here's some examples. This is from The Great Gatsby, by the way, just to give you a different book, right? Plus some of the jazz that students would be listening to while reading Cannery Row, Sweet Thursday, learning the history of the Monterey Jazz Festival and the lab. You can see this? Yeah. So this is what a student came up with when she listened to the entire album by Miles Davis, Sketches in Spain, and a Wes Montgomery album, and read Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday. So this is a connection of those mediums. And you can see that a few years ago, I would take students to the lab, and we'd spend a few days there. I used to take a lot of students. Now that I have a child, I only take a small group of students up there to do some concentrated work. But you can see them hanging on the back of the lab. You can see the students performing at the Embassy Suites in Seaside, a concert for people, playing jazz and classical music, and a lot of it rooted in the books Sweet Thursday and Cannery Row. Okay, so I only recently reread the book, and just it's so much fun to read Sweet Thursday. It's such a different story, a different book, almost an attempt to keep Ed Ricketts alive, which is also kind of sad. Yeah, and I love Mac's role in this book. Yeah, more of a strong narrator in the book, someone who has kind of this different ethos and trying to save Doc from not being able to write his paper, and also from falling in more doom. Sometimes I want a book to break loose with a bunch of hooptedoodle. The guy's writing it, give him a chance to a little hooptedoodle, spin up some pretty words, maybe, or sing a little song with language. And here's Duke Ellington's piece called The Misfit Blues. Now, before I continue, what did that sound like? What are your words to explain that? What did that sound like? Morose, bleak, sad, right? Gloomy, daunting, yeah. And if you
that era, the Great Depression, maybe,
yeah,
even.
Exactly. If you recall various parts of both novels, there's a gloom that sits on the community, right? But let's continue the song. Isn't that fun? Isn't that a nice audio text to articulate this duality of both pain and joy? To understand that they work together. Yeah. And that happens thematically through both books very often. Yeah. Oops, sorry. I also don't want to get away from, looking at language, as an English teacher, where, there is definitely a clear, there are clear examples where there's music in the language, right? This first quote is about Susie, right? That in Doc notices her walking. No, this girl walked with her shoulders back and her chin up and her arms swinging in rhythm. There was a flick of skirt and she was gone. But Doc could see in his mind her swinging limbs, the melody of her lip. And later in that same chapter, when he's working with an octopus, he looks out, he sees this octopus, and the octopus looked out and one of its arms flicked rhythmically as though it led an orchestra and the beat was gay and free and fluid, like the swinging thigh and knee and ankle, like someone dancing. Yeah. Now, if you've read Sweet Thursday, you know that there are these very interesting characters that we learn of pretty early on, and that's Mary and Joseph Rivas. Yeah, and of course, the book brings up some a little bit of archaic ways of looking at the Mexican American. Even the band's name, his nephew's band name has some racial overtones. They're called Los Mojados, right? But there's something about this character, Joseph and Mary Rivas, that is appealing, right? He's almost an embodiment of the Pachuco jazz experience. And, just to go over some basic things about the Pachuco, the Pachuco, you must know of Zoot Suit by Luis Valdez, right? Which discusses, reveals the race riots, right? The Pachuco riots. And the Pachuco, the word itself, which means El Paso, yeah? It maybe gets its roots in El Paso, but it really flourished here in Los Angeles. And there is a culture to it. The language, which is called Calo, which is almost some kind of like a pidgin-like hybridization of different languages. And there's a look to it, right? If you were hanging out in New York in the 30s, you would see African Americans dress very similarly, which you call the hipsters, the hep cats, yeah? And, when a lot of African Americans came here for war industry work in Los Angeles, a lot of clubs opened up. So jazz in Los Angeles used to be much more of a hotspot than it is now. And then the East Side took, kind of flourished as well. And that's when you had a lot of musicians like Lalo Guerrero that we'll talk about in a little bit. But there's never a direct mentioning of these musicians in Sweet Thursday. But clearly, Joseph and Mary, who has replaced Lee Chong, and his nephew, Cacahuete, which means peanut, there's something about them that is almost forcing us to pay attention to that cultural kind of phenomenon at the time. Before I continue, are there any questions that I might be able to answer about the Pachuco experience a little bit?
Doesn't Chinatown, the movie with Jack Nicholson, have a little part in there about the Chicano and this Zoot Suit part, or is it LA Confidential? I don't remember, but
I don't think it's Chinatown. I don't think it's Chinatown.
But the two Jakes.
Yeah, what a great play to read, obviously, is Zoot Suit. You can find it online. It's really accessible. There's another play, and it's by Culture Clash. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this Latino comedic troupe. They're called Culture Clash. I think in the 90s they had a TV show. And the play is called Chavez Ravine. Does anyone know what Chavez Ravine is?
Yes, Dodger Stadium ruined it. And
it's Dodger Stadium. So if you read that play, you get a lot of cool references to the Pachuco culture and how that combined with, McCarthyism and the Red Scare, it really kind of created real strong divisions in Los Angeles. And, when we think about Americanization and how we try to define certain people, we often look just simply at language versus the other cultural aspects such as music. Yeah. And, I'm not sure if you all are that familiar with the book, Sweet Thursday, but there's a part that really resonates with me when Susie asks, Joseph and Mary, are you Mexican? And his response is, American. My old man was Mexican. Yeah. So this phenomenon, the Pachuco blues jazz experience, is really Mexican American, and not just Mexican American, but with other kind of Latin nationalities also being brought into the music, as I'll show in a second. Okay. So you can see the hipsters, hepcats. You see up here you see Dizzy Gillespie, and you see others in Harlem. There's Minton's, which has been reopened for about, I don't know, 10 years now. You see this in Minton's in Harlem, but you just take a look. This is a way to respond to the forced imposition of definitions of being American. Of course, there's a rationing, thing going on in America, but this is a way of saying we get to decide how we want to be American. Yeah.
Professor, I'll call you Professor. I'm wondering if John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts, who both went to Mexico, not just on their Cia Cortez journey, but they made a film there, and Ed went to Mexico City for some time, if that all helped them come even more to appreciate or that. And then one thing also, when the Cia Cortez journey ended and they came back into the US at San Diego to say we're back, John Steinbeck stayed on the boat, but Ed Ricketts got off the boat and spent 2 days in LA, and he went downtown or Hollywood, Sunset, and heard Nat King Cole late at night on the first day after their month in the Cia Cortez, and so I'm just pointing out he clearly had a connection to music, not just marine biology.
Absolutely. And Steinbeck lived in Los Angeles for a bit.
Yes.
Right? He lived in Los Angeles, so he would have been aware of the kind of cultural scene, although he was didn't have a lot of money at the time. I think they were making their own beer at home, but he had a friend that taught at Oxy and at Occidental College. But I think he would have been aware at least of the cultural kind of strains at the time. And like I said before, Los Angeles used to have a lot of great jazz spots. The one I used to attend is gone forever because of COVID. Breaks my heart, called the Blue Whale. So one thing to understand is it's an interesting study to see how places get replaced and they become this erasure of culture and people and place. Yeah. So this idea not to forget that LA was definitely a hotspot for jazz. And some of you have heard of Cal Tjader, who made kind of Latin jazz kind of popular. So those things are important to understand when we look at some of these other artists. So I'm going to talk about Lalo Guerrero and Don Tosti. Steinbeck's characters, from Sweet Thursday, primarily Joseph and Mary and his nephew. They seem to be paying some kind of tribute to some of these Mexican Americans, better known as the Pachuco jazz boogie musicians, particularly these two that I mentioned. Post-World War II, LA was home to a lot of sophisticated urban blues. As I mentioned earlier, the African American experience with jazz was happening here, and it caught on. And you can tell, if you do a little research, you can see that African American and Mexican American culture, there's almost a mirroring at this time. In terms of how you looked, what you danced, and how you kind of, conducted yourself. So let's get into the book and some music that's in the book a little bit. Okay. We know that so many of the characters we love in Cannery Row are not present in Sweet Thursday. Right. Lee Chong has taken off. Maybe he's gone to some Pacific island. Yeah, maybe to Hawaii, who knows? And Dora passes away, right? And the girls are heartbroken. So they get drunk for 3 days. It's always 3 days, isn't it? They put on a lady drunk for 3 days. And you can hear them going through these kind of stages, through the walls. You can hear, they closed the brothel, but you could hear them kind of playing music and crying. And they played in a 3-part harmony, Rock of Ages, Asleep in the Deep, and St. James Infirmary. So let me play you this fun piece by Cab Calloway. Just a bit of it.
Do you see my baby there? She's stretched out on a long white table. So sweet, so cold, so fair. Let it go, God bless the road. Oh, whoa, 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 wherever she may be. She can search this whole wide world over, but she'll never find another sweet man like me. When I die, bury me in my straight leg breeches. Put on a box back coat and a Stetson hat. Put a $20 gold piece on my watch chain, so you can let all the boys know I died standing pat.
That was fun, huh? Y'all could see that here. Okay. And you know that Cab Calloway also famously dressed in the what we call the Pachuco outfit, very baggy clothes, and also was an important image of that time with respect to that kind of cultural kind of look. Well, that's a song in the book. There's another version. There's several versions of this song, but I like this performance. I also like the Louis Armstrong version of this song. You can imagine the girls singing this and wailing this song in the brothel. Let's see. Okay, so this is in reference to one of the, Joseph and Mary Rivas. Yeah. He's kind of hustling. He's a hustler, right? There's a lot of hustlers in these books. And it says, under his horrified eyes, an orchestra took shape. 2 guitars, a guitarron, rhythm and maraca, men, a tenor, and 2 baritones. He would have had the whole lot deported if his nephew Cacahuete had not joined them with his hot trumpet. Yeah. And let's hear the Pachuco Boogie.
Vine aquí al Oscar, me vine a parar garra, ve ese. Guacha este tacuche que traigo, ve que suave tramado es ese. Pero el carlanga está de aquella, ese en él, este carlanga está padre, ese lito, venga, ¿sabe qué? Vamos al hoy.
Now what you're hearing is some of the Calo language, right? The word that they use to talk about their jacket and their shoes and looking good, and my dad was born in 1942, and I don't know how he picked up some of the Calo, but when I was a kid here in Los Angeles, he'd say bye to my mom in the morning and he'd say, "I te watcho." And I never knew what that meant. Basically, I'll watch you later, right? And you can hear that kind of mixing of code switching of language in these songs, right? And, this is, you could argue, Mexican and American and Mexican American, yeah? Now, if you don't know the life of Joseph and Mary, it's really fascinating. Yeah. He grew up here in Los Angeles, and he was a kid who was always in trouble, but he was sly and he's always trying to, like I said earlier, hustle. But there's something really beautiful about him, which brings us to another theme that Steinbeck, really employs in his work, that there are certain codes that people live by, regardless of what they are, whether they're women who work at a brothel, bums, right? Or someone who's deemed, in some kind of lesser than American way, such as Joseph and Mary. At about this time, the Los Angeles Police Department had a puzzle on its hands. Marijuana was being distributed in fairly large quantities and a greatly reduced price. Every vacant lot was searched from San Pedro to Eagle Rock. I like Eagle Rock because that's where Steinbeck lived close to. Joseph and Mary Rivas might have been in trouble, but for the fact that the Los Angeles Police Department was in worse trouble. So here's a song that goes with that.
Marijuana boogie. Marijuana boogie. Marijuana, that's my baby's name. Póngase alerta ese vato, no se vaya al rol, porque va a empezar al rato el piano del cantón. Porque va a empezar al rato el Marijuana Boogie Boy. No se agüite ese pues, pégale duro esas teclas. Vamos pues a tronarnos las manos, digo yo. Voy a sacar una buena vaina para echar un buen borlo ese. Porque esta bota y aquella este boogie. Mi jaina se llama Juana. Pero ya todos los vatos le dicen marihuana. Marihuana, como te quiero yo.
What about that? Those guys were jamming, huh? Those guys were jamming. Yeah, Lalo Guerrero received the Medal of Honor for Arts, I think in the 80s. Bill Clinton gave it to him. I think he was the first Chicano to earn that award. Others earned it after, Luis Valdez, I'm sure others, Sandra Cisneros, the author. And it's really important to know that, yeah. Like I said earlier, it's not just through language, but it's through music and art and other forms of cultural artifacts that Mexican Americans during this time were able to construct their own hybrid identities. Yeah, there's the same dude, right? There he is in the middle right there. And, actually that's Don Tosti, but what you see, and Lalo Guerrero, you can see Lalo Guerrero with the maracas, yeah? But what you heard was more swingish music, right? You heard swing. But what if you kind of put a lot of different kind of music together to create your own version of jazz, yeah?
Including the use of the accordion.
That's right.
I'm thinking maybe in black jazz, you don't see the accordion very much. But that's right. Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I want to read this. I think it's really important. So, the existence and overlapping of lots of Latin American music communities, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, would also show its effect on Mexican American, musicians. Lalo Guerrero would also present the multinational Latin American side of Los Angeles Pachuco. So, he describes the Pachuco as dancing guaracha, danzones, rumbas, and botecitos in a song, for example, in the early 1940s, which a lot of you have heard because you've seen Zoot Suit. And the song is called Chuco Suaves, right? Which eventually was used in the soundtrack for Zoot Suit. That Guerrero cites the botecito, a brief rage in Latin American capitals. In the 1940s, offers an example of his keen awareness of Latin American pop music trends. And I think that's important to understand. You have somebody who understands, Latin American music and who's bringing it in to create a resistance to an imposed definition of American jazz, right? What it looks like and what it should sound like. Here's that song.
Póngase abusado, ya los tiempos han cambiado. Usted está muy agüitado y está bote atravesado. Antes se bailaba el swing, boogie woogie jitterbug, pero eso ya torció y esto es lo que sucedió. Los chucos suaves bailan rumba, bailan la rumba y le zumba, bailan guaracha sabrosón, el botecito y el danzón. Los chucos suaves bailan rumba, bailan la rumba y le zumba, bailan guaracha sabrosón, el botecito y el danzón. Los chucos suaves bailan rumba, bailan la rumba y le zumba, bailan guaracha sabrosón, el botecito y el danzón. Esa buena jaina pues, vamos a guarachar pues, carnala. Nel, que swing, Nel, eso del swing ya chale, ve. Por derecho ya chale.
You can hear him say, "Nah, let's just swing, ya con eso, it's over. Like, let's do our thing." Yeah. So they're resisting, right? This is a music of resistance in many ways, just like the way they look, the way they dress. Yeah. And earlier in the song, it says, los tiempos cambian, the times have changed. We got the jitterbug and the boogie woogie. Let's do our thing now. The Pachuco does other things as well. The botecito, for example. Yeah. And this is the kind of beautiful kind of connections that we're making with, for example, Cacahuete, who's the nephew who has a trumpet, and he's playing classical jazz. And he's also playing in this Mexican group, yeah, this Mexican group, and he's listening. He's reading Downbeat magazine. If you don't know what that is, that's a jazz magazine. Yeah. So this is what the uncle says about his nephew. "Drives me crazy," said Joseph and Mary. "Got a new trumpet, can't get away from it. Made him go practice down on the beach. Figured the waves and the sea lions would kind of drown him out. The other night, he gave a passing signal to a Navy tug, and they're still looking for what passed them. But the last night was the worst. He was practicing down on the beach, and he had aimed his damn trumpet in the sewer pipe. Got resonance," he said. I don't know if it's true, but I heard that every toilet in the whole neighborhood give off with stormy weather. And if you don't know that song, here's one version of it.
Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather. Since my man and I ain't together, keeps raining all of the time. Oh yeah, life is bad. Gloom and misery everywhere. Stormy weather, stormy weather, and I just can't get my poor self together. Oh, I'm weary all of the time.
Isn't that beautiful? Imagine Cacahuete playing that tune out there. And the beat goes on. Yeah, these are some covers of Downbeat. Yeah. I love this character, Cacahuete. Like there's some bridge with this kid, you know, this young man. Cacahuete was behind the counter studying a copy of Downbeat when Mac came in. He wore a purple windbreaker with gold piping. A lean and handsome boy. He had the wild and sullen light of genius in his eyes. And you can see that I put on the left side, you see Dizzy and my favorite musician, John Coltrane. My son's middle name is Coltrane. I don't know how I pulled that off, but and you see Poncho Sanchez, right? The conguero. Yeah. And you see one of my favorites, Nora Jones, which goes to show that, you know, jazz is played by everybody. Versions of it, our own versions of it, how we kind of appropriate our own definitions of it. So I wanted to play this just a tiny bit. If you went to the Monterey Jazz Festival this year, this is one of the groups that was performing. They're called Las Cafeteras. And I'm thinking this is a great, you know, other element to think about how music, you know, transcends and it's not jazz, but it's folk. Let's hear it, just as one of the last pieces we hear.
Take a deep breath. You feel good, just have a great performance, good energy, you know?
Yo nací de mi madre, yo nací de la flor, yo nací de la tierra, tengo el mismo color. Yo nací.
Nací de mi madre, yo nací de la flor, yo nací de la tierra, tengo el mismo color.
I had it queued up on a different song, but well, you got a little bit of that. Anyways, they're, you know, you should check them out, Las Cafeteras. And they're from East LA. Born here, raised here, kind of redoing what you call Chicano folk music. Oops, okay. So we've just got a few minutes before 5, and this is my old office at the Punahou Academy, where I had authors and jazz musicians only in my office. Yeah. And that's my email. It's 95bruinsfan@gmail. Please email me if you have any questions or you want to reach out or you want to nerd out a little bit on jazz. But I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Pete. That was awesome.
Sure.
What a really fun blending of music and literature and history, culture, all the things.
Thank you.
Do you have time to take one question from the
I'll take
chat
a few questions. I'm sorry. I don't know how cogent that was because I know I wanted to get a lot out, but I hope you enjoyed the music. You know, that's really the heart of, and the connections to Sweet Thursday and Cacahuete and his uncle. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm seeing a lot of like positive reactions in the crowd out there. So I think it was awesome. I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but one question did come in from Wayne. He says that the beat writers were really into jazz. Do you know if Steinbeck and Ricketts were aware of the beat writers, maybe influenced by them?
I don't know. I know there's some correlation with Steinbeck's interests and the beats interest. Of course, Dizzy, is kind of a centerpiece of some of this music, and the beats, they found Dizzy to be such a kind of a saint of the time. But Wayne, I wish I could answer that a little better right now, but that's a question I'll take with me for sure if they were aware of some of the beat writers. Yeah.
How would you categorize a group like Los Lobos?
Well, it's interesting. Los Lobos, there, is kind of a derivative of this kind of progression of music.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Thanks to what you just
they're
told.
often mentioned in the lineage of this kind of Chicano jazz folklore, because they can play straight Mexican music, and then Chicano folk, and then rock and roll. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
they're great.
that's the beauty of that band.
Cool. Well, Pete, I want to make sure that you get to go at 5, as you said, but just wanted to thank you again so much for coming tonight and for sharing your wealth of information and a really amazing playlist. So thank you. We really appreciate you.
I hope that Emily, I hope that you all got some of the names of the songs. They're easy to find, and you can create your own playlist. I have time for maybe one other question if there's one more.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you to Monterey Library too, and Ira Gershwin, and did Benny Goodman. I have a feeling Steinbeck and Ricketts, that must have been, they knew about that, the Ira Gershwin song, which is what is that famous song that's like blues and jazz, it's classical. I can't even think of it, but jeez. Anyways.
Well, sorry, I don't have the
Rhapsody in Blue.
Oh, Rhapsody in Blue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Amazing, I knew that.
Well, cool.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, you take care.
Thank
We'll
you,
see you
Pete.
soon. Absolutely. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks to the
Bye.
Monterey Public Library for hosting, and again to our sponsors, the Cannery Row Foundation, the Cannery Row Company, and the Western Flyer Foundation. And one more round of applause for Pete. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. Take care. Bye.
Have a great night.